When someone pulls away after hurting you, the natural reaction is to interpret that distance as a kind of judgment. It can feel like a quiet confirmation that what you shared with them did not hold enough value for them to remain close or stay present. But that interpretation, while emotionally very understandable, often fails to capture the deeper psychological process taking place underneath, especially when you are dealing with someone who has an avoidant attachment style. For an avoidant person, distance is rarely a simple expression of disinterest or emotional detachment in the way people often assume. It is not a clean break or a complete emotional shutdown. It is not the absence of feeling. It is something far more internally conflicted and layered. It is a form of self-protection that gets activated when their emotional system becomes too intense, too exposed, or too difficult for them to manage in that moment. You need to understand that the moment they realize they have hurt you, something shifts inside them in a destabilizing way. It is not just ordinary guilt, it is exposure. It is the sudden internal awareness that they have caused emotional harm, and that now there is an expectation of responsibility, repair, and emotional engagement. In that moment, vulnerability is no longer optional. For a person who has built their sense of safety around emotional control, independence, and psychological distance, that realization can feel like losing their footing. So instead of moving toward you to repair the rupture, they often move away in order to regain a sense of internal balance. From the outside, that movement looks like indifference or lack of care. It can appear as though they do not value what was broken enough to fix it. But internally, the experience is usually far more complex than that surface interpretation suggests. Internally, they are trying to reduce emotional overload. They are attempting to calm a surge of discomfort that they do not fully understand how to sit with or process. Their mind often starts working in a protective way, telling them that space will reduce intensity and that distance will prevent further harm. It can become an unconscious strategy of emotional regulation. In their internal reasoning, stepping back can feel like the responsible option. Thoughts like, if I stay close, I might make things worse, or if I try to fix this now, I will only increase the damage, or I do not know how to handle this properly, so I should step away first, begin to take shape. So distance becomes their solution, not because it actually resolves the emotional issue, but because it temporarily lowers the pressure they are feeling inside. This is where the core misunderstanding begins. Because while they experience distance as a way to regain control and reduce internal overwhelm, you experience that same distance as abandonment. You are left carrying the emotional weight of what happened, searching for acknowledgement, clarity, repair, or even basic presence that confirms your experience matters. Instead, you are met with silence or withdrawal. And that silence does not feel neutral at all. It feels like a continuation of the original wound, almost like a second layer of hurt placed on top of the first one. What is important to recognize here is that the avoidant response is not primarily designed to heal the relationship. It is designed to regulate the self. And those two goals are not the same. Healing requires engagement, emotional tolerance, discomfort, accountability, and the willingness to stay present even when things feel tense or heavy. It requires sitting in the emotional consequences long enough to understand them, and then taking consistent action to repair trust. But self-regulation, especially in an avoidant pattern, often prioritizes immediate relief over long-term resolution. So the person steps back, not realizing that in doing so, they are often extending the very emotional pain they are trying to escape. There is also a deeper layer to this dynamic. For many avoidant individuals, closeness is not experienced as purely safe connection. It is also experienced as risk. It carries the possibility of losing autonomy, of being emotionally overwhelmed, of being fully seen in ways that feel too exposing. So when conflict happens and they have hurt you, closeness suddenly carries even more weight. It is no longer just intimacy. It becomes accountability. It becomes emotional confrontation. If they have not developed the internal capacity to stay present in that kind of emotional exposure, then withdrawal becomes their default protective response. However, this protection is misapplied because what they are protecting themselves from is not actual danger, but emotional discomfort and internal conflict. In doing so, they unintentionally create the very outcome they fear most, which is disconnection. The painful irony is that the behavior meant to prevent loss actually contributes to it. The tragedy is not simply that they do not care. It is that their coping style blocks them from expressing care in a way that could maintain or repair the relationship. This leaves you in a confusing position. You may be dealing with someone who feels deeply on the inside, but whose external behavior communicates the opposite. Someone who pulls away at the exact moment when closeness, clarity, and repair are most needed. This is why it becomes so important not to confuse distance with truth about your worth or the value of the relationship. Distance in this context is not a direct statement about how important you are. It is more a reflection of how that person manages emotional stress and responsibility. However, this understanding does not mean you are supposed to carry the consequences endlessly. Intent does not erase impact. Even if their withdrawal is rooted in fear, overwhelm, or confusion, the outcome for you is still emotional absence, lack of acknowledgement, and unresolved pain. So the real question is not only why they distance themselves, but what you do in response to that distance. Do you interpret it as something you must chase, fix, or wait out indefinitely? Or do you recognize it as a limitation in their current capacity to engage in repair and emotional responsibility? Because distance that avoids accountability is not true protection. It is delay. And repeated delay over time turns into emotional loss. When you look deeper into that pattern, you often find something else underneath it. Something quieter but very powerful, which is guilt. Not healthy guilt that leads to repair and reconnection, but an unresolved, internalized form of guilt that becomes overwhelming rather than motivating. Instead of thinking, I need to fix this, it turns into, I am the problem, or I am someone who causes harm. And that identity becomes emotionally difficult to face. This is especially destabilizing for someone who prefers to see themselves as controlled, self-contained, and not emotionally disruptive to others. So rather than moving toward repair, they move away from the emotional meaning of what they have done. They begin building internal narratives that justify distance, such as, if I go back, I will only make it worse, or if I try to explain myself, I will be misunderstood, or if I stay involved, I will lose control of the situation again. These thoughts are not always fully conscious or intentional, but they serve the purpose of reducing emotional pressure, so distance starts to feel like responsibility, even though it is actually avoidance in disguise. Real responsibility does not remove you from the impact you created. It requires you to stay present within it, acknowledge it clearly, and take part in repairing it. That is exactly the emotional space avoidant patterns tend to struggle with the most. The complexity increases further because guilt does not disappear when they withdraw. It often remains present in the background. It appears in quiet moments, in memories, and in the awareness that something remains unresolved. But instead of guiding them back toward repair, it often reinforces the belief that returning would be too difficult, or that they are not capable of handling the emotional intensity of the situation. So the avoidance becomes self-reinforcing. The more they feel they have failed, the less likely they are to try again. From your perspective, this can be deeply confusing because you likely associate guilt with reconnection, accountability, and action. In healthier relational dynamics, guilt often leads to apology, conversation, change, and repair. So when none of that appears, it is natural to assume the feeling is absent. But in many avoidant dynamics, the feeling is present internally but does not translate into behavior that supports repair. And relationships are not sustained by internal emotion alone. They are sustained by consistent, observable action, communication, and a willingness to remain present through discomfort. This is why unresolved guilt can sometimes be more damaging than no guilt at all, because it creates internal tension without external repair, leaving everything suspended in a state of emotional incompletion. There is a sense that something exists beneath the surface, but no real action to confirm it. And that confusion can keep you emotionally tied to something that is not actually moving forward. It keeps you waiting for a response that never truly arrives. And over time, that waiting turns into its own kind of emotional pressure. You begin to question not only their behavior, but also your own understanding of the situation. You start to wonder if you are asking for too much, if you are interpreting things incorrectly, if maybe their silence means something different than what it feels like. But it does not. Silence in this situation is not a neutral space. It is an active absence of repair. And no matter what inner conflict is causing it, the outcome remains the same. You are left without closure. So while it is important to understand the psychological reasons behind their behavior, it is equally important not to let that understanding replace your own needs. Empathy should not become a substitute for responsibility. Awareness should not turn into an excuse for doing nothing, because at a certain point, the reason behind someone's withdrawal becomes less important than the reality it creates. And the reality is simple. If guilt stops someone from showing up, from speaking honestly, from taking responsibility, then that guilt is not helping the relationship, it is blocking it. You cannot build something meaningful with someone who only processes things internally but remains absent externally. So you are left with a truth that may feel uncomfortable, but it is necessary. Guilt that avoids responsibility is not true remorse. It is withdrawal. And when you begin to understand how guilt turns inward and distance becomes a form of retreat, another layer appears, one that is often the most confusing from the outside. Because even in that distance, even in that silence, the connection does not simply disappear for them. It changes form. This is where you face a difficult truth. They can miss you and still not return. For many people, missing someone naturally leads to action. It creates a pull toward reconnection, a desire to close the gap, to say something, to do something that restores what was lost. But for someone who avoids emotional discomfort, that internal feeling does not function the same way. It stays inside, almost separated from action. They feel the absence, but they do not act on it. And this is not because the feeling is small. In many cases, it is the opposite. The feeling is strong enough to be noticed, to return repeatedly, to remain present in quiet moments. They think about what you shared. They replay conversations. They recognize what mattered. There is an awareness of loss. But awareness does not necessarily lead to movement, because the same internal system that made them pull away in the first place is still active. The same fear of emotional exposure, the same discomfort with vulnerability, the same uncertainty about how to repair what was damaged. All of that continues to exist. So instead of letting longing guide them back to you, they hold it internally. They sit with it instead of acting on it. And slowly something subtle begins to happen. That longing, instead of pushing reconnection, becomes more distant in form. It turns into thought rather than behavior. You become a memory they revisit instead of a person they reach out to directly. This is where idealization can begin to appear. Because when someone is no longer part of your daily reality, it becomes easier to reshape the story in your mind. The harder parts soften. The tension fades. What remains is a version of the connection that feels easier to hold, one that exists without real-time demands or emotional pressure. So they may start to see you not as your full, complex self, but as a symbol of something they once had, something meaningful, something rare, something that made them feel deeply. But even that understanding does not always bring them back, because returning would mean leaving that controlled internal space and entering something real again. It would mean facing the unresolved parts of the connection, dealing with the hurt, and confronting the uncertainty of your response. And for someone already inclined to avoid emotional pressure, that step feels too heavy. So they remain where it feels safer, in thought, not in action. And this is where the gap becomes most painful for you, because from your side, love, care, and connection are shown through presence, effort, and willingness to show up even when it is difficult. So when someone stays silent, when they do not reach out, when they do not repair, it feels like a clear message. It feels like you did not matter enough. But the reality is more complex and often more frustrating. It is not that you did not matter. It is that what you represented required more emotional capacity than they currently have. So instead of stepping into that, they retreat into a version of the connection that does not ask anything from them. This creates an emotional imbalance. You are dealing with reality, what happened, what was said, what needs repair. They are dealing with an internal version, what they felt, what they remember, what they can think about without discomfort, and those two experiences do not meet. They exist side by side, but they do not connect. This is why it can feel like you are holding something real while they are holding something distant. You are responding to the relationship as it was lived, while they are responding to it as it is remembered. And memory, unlike real life, does not demand responsibility. It does not ask for apology. It does not require explanation. It does not push for change. It simply allows feeling without action. But that kind of connection, if it can even be called that, is incomplete. Because real connection is not built on feeling alone. It requires participation. It requires effort. It requires the willingness to move towards someone, not just think about them. And when that movement is missing, the connection begins to fade. Not always in their mind, but in real life. So you are left with a situation that feels contradictory. Someone may still think about you, may still feel something for you, may still recognize your value, and yet remain fully absent from your life. And the natural hope is that those feelings will eventually turn into action. That one day what they feel inside will become strong enough to overcome fear. But that shift does not happen on its own, because feeling deeply is not the same as being ready to act. And until those two align, nothing truly changes. So the clarity you need to reach is this. You cannot build a relationship on someone's internal experience of you. You cannot rely on thoughts, memories, or unspoken emotions, no matter how real they feel to that person. If they are not turned into steady, visible action, they do not create stability. They create uncertainty. And over time, uncertainty weakens trust, safety, and emotional balance. So while they may miss you in silence, while they may carry pieces of you privately, that alone is not enough to sustain a connection that requires presence. Because what is not expressed cannot be fully shared, and what cannot be shared cannot be maintained. And when you bring all of this together, the distance, the guilt that turns inward, the silence that still contains emotion, you reach the central tension in this kind of avoidant pattern. It is not only that they leave, it is that they are internally divided while leaving. Because at the core, there are always two forces operating at the same time. One is the desire for closeness, for connection, for emotional safety with another person, and the other is an equally strong fear of what that closeness requires once it becomes real. Vulnerability, responsibility, exposure, and the risk of being overwhelmed by emotions they do not feel ready to handle. And these two forces do not cancel each other out. They exist together, constantly and uneasily. So when they hurt you and then withdraw, what you are seeing is not a simple decision. It is an unresolved inner conflict, a divided state where one part of them knows they care and another part believes that staying close will only increase harm for both you and them. And instead of actually working through that conflict and bringing it into resolution, they step away from it. They distance themselves from the tension as a way to manage it. They try to maintain space, believing that distance will make things easier to handle. But keeping things contained is not the same as resolving them. Containment does not solve the problem. It only holds it in place temporarily. What usually happens after that is a repeating cycle that continues inside them even when they are not physically present in the situation. The feelings do not simply end or disappear. The desire connected to you does not fully go away. It comes back again in quiet moments, when everything is calm, in emotional pauses, and in the small spaces where distraction is no longer strong enough to cover it. In those moments, they can feel the pull again, the pull that moves them toward reconnection, towards you, toward what once existed. But almost at the same time, another force appears within them. That is the resistance. That is the awareness of all the emotional weight that would return if they came back. That is the memory of what would need to be faced, explained, or repaired if they stepped closer again. So they end up stuck between two emotional experiences that both feel real but do not align with each other. One part moves toward connection, and another part pulls away from it at the same time. This is why they remain in a suspended state, as if they are paused between two directions. They are not fully present and not fully gone. They are held in a middle space of motion that never fully completes. And this is exactly the place where most misunderstandings start. From your perspective, being distant appears like a clear conclusion. It looks like absence equals decision. It feels like if someone truly cared, they would move closer. If someone genuinely valued the connection, they would try to repair it. If someone truly wanted you in their life, there would be consistent behavior that proves it. This way of interpreting things is natural because most people link emotion and action in a direct and visible way. But what is happening here is not that simple. You are dealing with a situation where emotional desire does not translate smoothly into behavior. Intention may exist, but it gets interrupted before it becomes action. Internal feelings are real, but they do not always reach the outside world in a stable or consistent form. There is a divide between what is experienced internally and what is expressed externally. That gap creates confusion for the person who is waiting for consistency, because what they observe does not match what they assume is happening inside. So what you are facing is not someone who is completely absent from the connection. It is not a clean or simple disappearance. Instead, it is someone who is emotionally present at moments, but unstable in their outward behavior. There are times when feeling is clearly there, when awareness is active, when emotional recognition is obvious. But those moments do not transform into consistent action. They do not become reliable communication or steady effort over time. This type of pattern makes letting go extremely difficult because the situation is not empty. If there was nothing there at all, the mind would eventually accept that and close the emotional loop. Over time, it would become clearer that there is no direction left. But when emotion exists without action and awareness exists without follow-through, it creates a gap that the mind keeps trying to interpret. That gap becomes space for assumptions. It becomes space for hope. It becomes space for waiting and thinking that something might still shift later on. Maybe timing will change things. Maybe distance will create clarity. Maybe they will eventually realize what was lost and return differently. What often goes unnoticed is that this kind of internal conflict does not resolve itself simply because time passes. Time alone does not merge fear and desire into clarity. Distance alone does not automatically make someone emotionally ready. Silence alone does not produce understanding or emotional stability. In many avoidant emotional patterns, time can actually reinforce the avoidance rather than dissolve it. The longer the distance continues, the more the mind adapts to it. The internal narrative slowly reorganizes itself around the idea that distance feels safer. The emotional system begins to treat staying away as the lower-risk choice. Returning does not become easier over time. In many cases, it becomes more emotionally loaded because it gets associated with pressure, vulnerability, and emotional exposure. So the conflict inside does not disappear, but it becomes less visible outwardly. It quiets down on the surface without actually resolving internally. Because of this, it becomes important to adjust how the situation is understood. It is easy to take internal struggle and turn it into meaning about potential. It is easy to assume that if someone feels conflicted, then change must be close. It is easy to believe that emotional tension automatically leads